The first time Emma Sinclair stepped into Damien Blackwood's mansion, she felt like she had walked into a museum designed to suffocate. Everything was cold, pristine marble floors, dark wooden staircases, and towering windows that let in light but no warmth. Even the air smelled expensive, like leather and aged whiskey, with a faint hint of something else she couldn't quite name. She didn't belong here. Emma had no choice, though. With her art career in shambles and her rent 2 months overdue, she had jumped at the opportunity to work as Damien Blackwood's personal assistant. She had never met him in person before today, only heard the rumors, whispers of a man who ruled his world with an iron fist, who destroyed anyone who crossed him. A billionaire with no patience for weakness. Now, standing in the grand foyer, she wondered if she had made a mistake. A butler, expressionless and stiff, led her through a series of corridors until they reached a set of massive double doors. He knocked once before pushing them open. Inside, behind a sleek mahogany desk, sat Damien Blackwood. The first thing Emma noticed was his presence, cold, commanding, and completely unnerving. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that made her breath catch. Sharp jawline, piercing gray eyes, dark hair neatly styled. But there was something else, something unsettling about the way he watched her as she stepped forward. "Miss Sinclair," he said smoothly, his voice low and rich. "You're late." Her stomach tightened. She wasn't. She had arrived 5 minutes early. She stopped herself. Defending her punctuality wouldn't change anything. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood." His gaze flickered over her, assessing, before he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Emma obeyed, gripping the edges of the seat to steady herself. "You'll be on call 24/7. I expect efficiency, discretion, and absolute loyalty." His voice was void of warmth, each word precise and final. "If you can't handle that, leave now." A test. Emma swallowed hard and lifted her chin. "I can handle it." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, gone too quickly to be certain it had ever been there. "Good," he murmured. "Then let's begin." Days passed in a blur of impossible demands. Emma quickly learned that working for Damien Blackwood was like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. His expectations were ruthless. Every mistake was met with a single, chilling glance that made her stomach drop. And yet, despite his cold demeanor, she felt the pull of something dark and dangerous whenever he was near. It wasn't until the night she found the hidden room that she realized just how deep that danger ran. She had been searching for the library, intending to return one of the books he had lent her, a rare, leather-bound novel she wasn't sure she was even supposed to have. The mansion was massive, its hallways endless and winding. She had taken a wrong turn when she noticed a door slightly ajar at the end of the corridor. Curiosity got the best of her. She pushed it open, stepping inside, only to freeze. The room was filled with paintings. Her paintings. Every canvas, every sketch, was of her. Some were recent, others older, as if he had been painting her for years. Some were soft, almost reverent. Others were darker, capturing her in ways she had never seen herself before, desperate, wanting, utterly consumed. Her heart pounded. Behind her, the door clicked shut. "You weren't supposed to see this," Damien's voice murmured, deep and unshaken. Emma turned slowly, her breath hitching as she found him standing in the shadows, watching her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "How long?" she whispered, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. His lips curled slightly. "Long enough." A dangerous silence stretched between them. "Run," her mind screamed. But her body, her traitorous body, remained frozen, trapped by the undeniable pull between them. "Why?" she demanded, her voice stronger this time. Damien stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Because you belong to me, Emma," he said, voice dark with certainty. "You always have." Emma's breath came shallow as Damien's words settled between them. "You belong to me." The room seemed smaller now, the air thick with something unnamed. She should have been afraid. She should have turned and run. But all she could do was stare at him, at the way his gray eyes burned with something raw, something unshakable. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Damien tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "You walked into my world the moment you took this job, Emma. That means you are mine to protect and mine to keep." Her heart pounded against her ribs. There was no anger in his tone, no threat. Just certainty. She took a step back, her fingers brushing against one of the paintings. She glanced at it, a hauntingly beautiful portrait of her, caught mid-laugh. She didn't remember the last time she had looked that carefree. Had he painted her from memory? From a photograph? "You've been watching me," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The admission was unapologetic, stripped of any pretense. She swallowed hard. For how long? Damien took a measured step forward. "Years." A shiver ran down her spine. "This isn't normal," she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "People don't do this." Something flickered in his expression, something almost like amusement. "You don't know the kind of people I deal with, Emma." His voice dropped lower. "Normal isn't in my vocabulary." She pressed a hand to her temple, her thoughts spiraling. "This is insane." He exhaled softly. "Is it?" Emma didn't have an answer. She needed to leave, needed space to think. But before she could step around him, Damien reached out, not to grab her, but to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was featherlight, almost reverent. Her breath caught. "Tell me," he murmured. "Are you afraid of me?" Emma should have lied. She should have said yes, should have turned and fled. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. No. Because fear wasn't what she felt. It was something far more dangerous. Days passed, but the secret between them remained. Emma went about her work as if nothing had changed, but she could feel Damien's presence everywhere. His gaze lingered a second too long whenever she entered a room. His voice dipped lower when he spoke to her. And sometimes, when she thought she was alone, she would turn to find him watching her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. She should have left, but she didn't. Late one night, as she was sorting through documents in his study, she felt it again, that prickling awareness of being observed. She glanced up and found Damien standing in the doorway, his jacket discarded, the first few buttons of his shirt undone. He looked different, less composed. "You should be sleeping," he said. She arched a brow. "So should you." His lips curved slightly. "Touché." Emma set down the papers. "Do you always work this late?" "I could ask you the same thing." He stepped further into the room, his presence filling the space. "You're different from the others." She frowned. "Others?" "The assistants before you." His gaze flickered to the fireplace, where embers still glowed faintly. None of them lasted long. She crossed her arms. "Let me guess, because you're impossible to work for?" Damien chuckled, a rare sound that sent warmth curling through her. "That, and because I didn't want them here." Emma swallowed. "But you want me here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer, until there were only inches between them. "I do," he murmured. Her pulse skittered. It was dangerous, this thing between them. Unspoken, undefined, but impossible to ignore. She should step away. She should break the moment before it swallowed her whole. But then Damien did something unexpected. He reached out and gently took her hand. "Stay," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Emma looked at their hands, his fingers wrapped around hers, warm and steady. And against every rational thought, she didn't pull away. She stayed. Emma told herself she was staying because of the paycheck, because she needed the job, because walking away would mean stepping back into uncertainty, into a life where her art was nothing more than a dream slipping through her fingers. That was the lie she repeated to herself. The truth was far more dangerous. Since the night she found the hidden room, something had shifted between her and Damien. He hadn't spoken of it again, hadn't mentioned the paintings or his obsession with her. But it was there, an unspoken thing lurking in every stolen glance, every brush of fingertips when he handed her a document, every low murmur of her name when they were alone. She should have demanded answers. She should have confronted him. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, thick with something neither of them acknowledged. Until the night, everything changed. It started with a storm. Thunder rolled in the distance as Emma sat curled on the leather couch in Damien's study, trying to focus on the invoices she was supposed to be organizing. She had stayed late, as she often did, because the mansion felt different at night, quieter, less suffocating, less like a gilded cage. The storm grew stronger, rain pelting against the windows in relentless waves. She glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. She should go home. With a sigh, she began gathering her things, but just as she reached for her coat, the study door creaked open.
Damien.
Her breath caught. He was dressed more casually than usual, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up, exposing the strong lines of his forearms. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he had been running his fingers through it. "You're still here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I lost track of time." She hesitated, then added, "I was just leaving." A flicker of something crossed his face, but he didn't move from the doorway. "The storm's getting worse," he said. "Stay." Emma stiffened. "Damien. Just for tonight." His voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "I don't want you driving in this weather." That wasn't the real reason. She knew it. He knew it. But she didn't call him out on it. Instead, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. Something in his posture eased. "Come with me," he said. Emma hesitated for only a moment before following him out of the study. He led her through the darkened hallways until they reached a balcony overlooking the city. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the distant skyline shimmering under the streetlights. For a long moment, they stood in silence, side by side. "You never ask me about the paintings," Damien said suddenly. Emma's stomach tightened. She had thought about them every night since she had discovered them, about the meaning behind them, about what it meant that he had been watching her for years. But asking meant acknowledging the truth. And she wasn't sure she was ready for it. "You never explain them," she countered. A small smirk ghosted across his lips. "Would you believe me if I told you they started as a mistake?" She turned to face him, arching a brow. "A mistake?" "I saw you once years ago," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "You were painting in a park, completely lost in your work. I was drawn to you. So I painted you." Emma's throat tightened. "And then," she whispered. Damien turned to her fully, his gaze dark and unreadable. "And then I couldn't stop." A shiver ran down her spine. Not from fear. From something else entirely. "This isn't normal, Damien," she said, echoing the words she had told him before. "No," he agreed. "It's not." A sharp gust of wind blew past them, sending a strand of her hair across her face. Before she could move, Damien reached out, brushing it away with gentle fingers. Emma froze. His touch lingered, his thumb ghosting over her cheek. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. Her lips parted, her breath unsteady. This was the moment to break whatever was pulling them together, to step away before it was too late. But she didn't say a word. And Damien, he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. Not a kiss.
Not yet.
Just a promise. A dangerous, unspoken promise. And for the first time since she had stepped into his world, Emma wasn't sure if she wanted to run from it. Or fall deeper. Emma didn't sleep that night. Even after Damien left her standing on the balcony, even after she returned to the guest room he had prepared for her, her mind refused to quiet. She could still feel the ghost of his touch on her cheek. Still hear his voice. "Tell me to stop."
She should have.
She should have pulled away, set a boundary. Instead, she had let him get too close. Too close to something she wasn't sure she could handle. But despite everything, she hadn't felt fear. And that terrified her more than anything. The next morning, she told herself things would return to normal. She would go back to being his assistant. He would go back to being the impossible, ruthless billionaire she worked for. They would pretend last night never happened. But as soon as she walked into his office, she knew that was a lie. Damien was seated behind his desk, dressed in his usual crisp black suit. But the moment she entered, his eyes lifted to hers, dark and unreadable. Something had changed. "Morning," she said, keeping her voice even. "Morning," he echoed, but there was a subtle edge to his tone. Emma forced herself to focus on her work, typing up an email on her laptop. But she could feel his gaze lingering, watching, waiting.
Emma.
Her fingers stilled. She looked up, meeting his intense stare. "Yes." A pause. Then, "Come here." Her pulse skipped. It was a command, but there was something else beneath it. Something softer. Something uncertain. Slowly, she stood and crossed the room, stopping just in front of his desk. Damien didn't move, didn't say anything at first. He just studied her, as if debating something. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small box. "For you," he said simply, sliding it across the polished surface. Emma frowned. "What is it?" "Open it." She hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside was a key. Her brows furrowed. "What is this for?" Damien leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Your new apartment." Her breath hitched. "What?" His voice was calm, controlled. "I bought you a place. It's in a secure building, close to the art district. I've already arranged for your things to be moved." Shock turned to disbelief. "You bought me an apartment? You need somewhere better to live." "Damien, this is insane," she said, shaking her head. "You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted smoothly. "And I did." Her pulse pounded. "I don't need you to take care of me." His gaze darkened. "I know." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "But I will." Emma exhaled sharply, pushing the box back toward him. "I can't accept this." "You can." "Damien."
Emma.
His voice was quiet, but firm. "You live in a shoebox. It isn't safe. You know that." She swallowed. He wasn't wrong. Her current apartment was tiny, barely enough to fit her bed and easel. The neighborhood wasn't great either. But that didn't mean she could just let him buy her something better. This is too much," she whispered. His jaw clenched. "It's not." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then Damien stood, rounding the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. He was close. Too close. She should have stepped back. But she didn't. "Let me take care of you, Emma," he murmured. "Just this once." Her breath hitched. There was something raw in his voice, something almost desperate. It was dangerous. It was tempting. And it was completely, utterly wrong. She should say no. She should walk away. But instead, her fingers curled around the key. "And, Damien," he smiled. Emma stood in the doorway of her new apartment, still reeling. It was beautiful, modern, spacious, with tall windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was nothing like the cramped space she had lived in before. But no matter how stunning it wasn't hers.
Not really.
She set her bags down, exhaling slowly. This was a mistake. Accepting the key had been a mistake. She needed to set boundaries, needed to remind Damien that she wasn't his to control. Before she could second-guess herself, she pulled out her phone and typed out a message. "Emma, we need to talk." The reply came almost instantly. "Damien, I'll be there in an hour." Her stomach twisted. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this conversation. But it had to happen. An hour later, a knock sounded at the door. Emma hesitated before opening it. Damien stood on the other side, his expression unreadable. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, his presence overwhelming the space instantly. "You don't like it," he said, glancing around. "I didn't say that. But you're thinking it." Emma crossed her arms. "Damien, I can't just live in a place you bought for me." "Why not?" "Because that's not normal." His gaze darkened. "We've already established that I'm not normal." She groaned, running a hand through her hair. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You don't own me, Damien." Silence. "Then, are you sure?" Her breath caught. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Because every time I get close to you, you don't pull away." Emma's throat went dry. He was right. And that was the problem. "This," she whispered, shaking her head. This is dangerous. Damien tilted his head, studying her. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached out, brushing his fingers along her wrist. A shiver ran through her. Then tell me to stop, he murmured. Emma's heart pounded.
She should.
She needed to, but the words refused to come. Damien's lips curled slightly, as if he already knew the answer. And when he finally stepped back, putting space between them, she felt the loss like a physical ache. You can keep the key, he said, his voice smooth and unreadable. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, breathless and shaken. She clutched the key in her hand, staring at the closed door. She was in trouble, because the longer she stayed in his world, the less she wanted to leave. Emma wanted to pretend that her life hadn't changed, that moving into the new apartment didn't shift something irrevocably between her and Damien, that his intense, unrelenting attention wasn't starting to consume her thoughts. But every time she closed her eyes, she felt it. Felt him. The way he watched her, the way his touch lingered too long, the way his words wrapped around her like silk and steel. He was always there. And somehow, she wasn't sure if she wanted to escape anymore. Days passed and Damien grew worse. Or maybe she had simply started noticing the signs. The way his gaze would darken whenever she spoke to another man. The way his fingers would tighten around his whiskey glass when she laughed at something that wasn't him. The way he was always watching. At first, she thought it was paranoia. Then, she found the sketchbook. It happened on a Friday evening. Emma had been going through the bookshelves in his study, organizing files he had carelessly left behind.
It was supposed to be a simple task.
Something mundane. Then, in the middle of one of the drawers, she found a thick, leather-bound sketchbook. Curious, she flipped it open, and the breath was stolen from her lungs. Page after page. It was her.
Not just paintings this time.
Sketches, hundreds of them, each more intricate than the last. Some were hurried, frantic lines as if he had drawn them in desperation. Others were painfully detailed, capturing the soft curve of her lips, the arch of her brow, the way her fingers moved when she held a paintbrush. Some of them were from years ago. She recognized her old apartment in one of them, the one she had lived in before the city, before she ever met Damien. Her hands shook as she turned the pages. There were sketches of her walking through crowded streets, sketches of her sitting alone in cafes, sketches of her asleep in her bed. She felt sick. How long had he been watching her? Her stomach twisted, dread pooling in her veins. This wasn't admiration. This wasn't some fleeting attraction. This was obsession. And she had walked right into it. Before she could process what she was looking at, the door creaked open. Emma's blood ran cold. Damien stood in the doorway. His sharp suit was immaculate, his tie slightly loosened as if he had just returned from a long meeting. But his face was unreadable. His eyes flickered to the sketchbook in her hands. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. The air in the room turned suffocating. Slowly, deliberately, he shut the door behind him. Emma's heart pounded. "You're not supposed to see that," he said quietly. His voice was calm. Too calm. Emma forced herself to stand her ground. "How long?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step toward her, and she instinctively stepped back, her spine pressing against the bookshelf. "Damien," she tried again, her voice unsteady. "How long have you been watching me?" His gaze locked onto hers, dark and unreadable. "Always." The word was barely a whisper. Emma's breath hitched. "That's not normal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A slow, almost cruel smile ghosted across his lips. "I never claimed to be normal, Emma." A shiver ran down her spine. She should have been afraid. And she was. But mixed with that fear was something else. Something far more dangerous. Because beneath the obsession, beneath the madness in his gaze, there was something raw. Something that looked a lot like need. And, God help her, some part of her wanted to be needed like that. Emma didn't leave that night. She should have. She should have run, should have packed her things and never looked back. But she didn't. Instead, she sat across from Damien in his dimly lit study, the sketchbook still between them like a silent confession neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "You should hate me," Damien said suddenly. Emma exhaled sharply. "Maybe I do." A shadow of a smirk crossed his lips. "Then why are you still here?" She had no answer. And Damien, he looked at her like he already knew why. "I never meant for you to find out this way," he murmured. "Then how are you planning to tell me?" she shot back. "Over dinner. By the way, I've been obsessed with you for years. Pass the salt?" A dark chuckle escaped him. "I don't expect you to understand," he said, tilting his head. "But I never wanted to hurt you, Emma. He trailed off, searching for the right words. "I just needed to keep you." The breath left her lungs. Keep her. As if she belonged to him. As if she always had. Emma's hands clenched. "That's not how this works, Damien." A flicker of something crossed his face, something sharp, possessive. "Isn't it?" She swallowed hard. She needed to get out. Needed to leave before she drowned in whatever this was. But when she moved to stand, Damien's fingers wrapped around her wrist. Gentle. Unyielding. "Don't," he murmured. Emma looked up at him, at the way his gaze burned into hers, at the quiet desperation hidden beneath the control. "Damien." His grip tightened just slightly. "Stay." It wasn't a request. It was a demand. A plea. A trap. And Emma, God help her, was already caught in it. Emma didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the luxurious bed Damien had given her, staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling into chaos. She had seen the proof of his obsession. She had felt it in the way he looked at her, in the way his fingers had tightened around her wrist, as if letting her go would shatter something inside him. And yet she hadn't run. She should have packed her things and left, disappeared before he pulled her any deeper into this dark, twisted devotion. But she didn't. Because some part of her, some reckless, ruined part of her, wanted to understand. The next morning she made a decision. She needed to know the truth. How long had this obsession existed? How far had it gone? And, most importantly, why her? Emma didn't ask Damien outright. She knew better than that. Instead, she searched.
She started with his office.
And what she found changed everything. Behind a locked cabinet, buried beneath files of business dealings and contracts, she found the photographs. Hundreds of them. Pictures of her from years ago. Emma gasped as she flipped through them, her hands trembling. Some were from when she was in art school, struggling to make ends meet. Others were older, so much older that she couldn't even remember when they had been taken. One in particular made her blood run cold. It was a photograph of her as a child. A little girl, no older than 6, sitting on a swing set, staring up at the sky. And behind her, barely visible in the shadows, stood a young boy. Watching. Emma's hands shook violently as realization struck her like a thunderbolt. "It's not just years," she whispered to herself. "It's my whole life." Damien hadn't just been obsessed with her for a few years. He had known her since childhood. He had always been watching. She confronted him that night. The moment he walked into the apartment, she was waiting. "How long, Damien?" she demanded. He stilled. His coat was still draped over his arm, his tie loosened as if he had just come from a long night. But his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, watched her carefully. "How long what?" he asked quietly. Emma's chest tightened. "How long have you been watching me?" Silence. Then, "Always." The same answer as before. Only this time she understood what it meant. Damien didn't just love her. He belonged to her. From the moment he saw her, he had decided. Emma was his. And nothing, not time, not distance, not even her own will, would change that. She should have been terrified. But the scariest thing was the way her body betrayed her. Because instead of pulling away, she stepped closer. "That's not love, Damien," she whispered. His lips curled slightly, but there was no amusement in his eyes. "Isn't it?" She hated the way her pulse raced. Hated the way his voice wrapped around her, dragging her deeper into the madness of him. "You don't get to decide my life," she whispered. "But I do," he murmured. "Because you are my life, Emma." His hand lifted, fingers brushing against her cheek. She should have pushed him away. But instead, her breath caught, because the truth was somewhere in the tangled mess of obsession and desire. She wanted him to. Emma didn't run. She didn't fight. She let herself fall, because she was already trapped, because she wanted the madness, because maybe, just maybe, she had always been waiting for someone like Damien to break her open and put her back together again. So when his lips finally crashed against hers, she didn't resist. She devoured him just as desperately as he had devoured her for years. She let him consume her. And as Damien pulled her into his arms, as his hands gripped her with a possessive hunger that burned through her like wildfire, she realized she had never stood a chance. She was his. And she always had been.